The two outdoorsmen got together once a year to go on hikes through their native mountains in the mostly unexplored wilderness of Western Canada, just north of Washington state. Both men were past the 50-year mark, but they hadn't slowed down when it came to the areas they chose to explore. They had fishing poles, all the important tools for camping, and a couple of containers of bear spray for protection. Both men would tell you it was foolish to go into the wild of Canada without a firearm, but neither could bring themselves to do so. Clay Summers said he didn't think he would use it if he had one, so there was little sense in carrying all that extra weight. John Clarington said he was confident in his ability to handle animals and that his days of killing were long behind him. They had been out on their hike for just 3 days when the trouble began. A bear backed them down to a spot overlooking the stream they had been following for their hike because it provided their fishing. The big Grizzly charged them, forcing them to leave behind their packs, which they had been lucky to have taken off their backs for a quick rest stop. If they had the packs on them, they would never have made the distance necessary for their jump to end up in the water instead of on the rocks alongside it. Inside their packs were both tents, first aid kits, supplies, hatchets, and cooking utensils. Wisely, each man carried on his person a watertight emergency kit, which meant they still had a few tools on them. This was exactly the kind of situation as to why you would carry a separate emergency kit with you when hiking. Always have a backup plan when possible. To round out their available resources, each man carried a multi-tool, which featured pliers, a knife, and many of the other little features found on such tools. That was an exciting part of this story, but it is hardly the story in full. When the men were forced to jump off the ledge overlooking the stream below, both men had the chance to see a Sasquatch. It had been almost directly below the spot where they had jumped off. They had not seen it until after leaping because the cliff hid its position. They shot past it and on down into the water. It took a ways down the stream before they were able to get themselves over to a shore so they could get out. The water was plenty cold, despite it being summertime. The two men decided they would be better off to get a fire going and get themselves dry clothes to wear than to try and make their way back to where they had lost their packs. The bear or the Sasquatch might still be there. They didn't want to see either one. They got a fire going just as the sun was beginning to disappear over the horizon. Clay Summers said, "Do you think that big Sass was trailing us? Or perhaps the Grizzly?" John Clarington replied, "Anybody's guess. I just hope that bear is through with us. People make vague claims about the Sass which make them sound violent, but truth told is there are many more reports of bear mauling than of a Sass attacking anyone. I'm worried about the bear." Clay said, "The thing is that the bear won't likely be after us unless it can pick up our scent again. That Sass might be smart enough to have figured out why we jumped and where we would likely be getting out of the water assuming we made it at all." John asked, "You think we are far enough down the stream to be out of distance for it to pick up our scent?" Clay stuck his finger in his mouth and then held it up to the breeze. The wind was not in their favor. "I don't know. Hard to say. The wind is blowing back toward where we left the bear so it could pick up our scent. Starting the fire probably didn't help our cause. I would guess our best bet is to overnight here next to the water's edge, so if we have to go back into the water, we can. If it were daytime, I would say we might not be able to count on the water to take us to safety, because the bear might be able to outrun our progress, being carried downstream, but since it is dark, he won't be able to see us when we are underwater. I suggest that is our best chance of escape if he comes tonight. So we'll stay here tonight, and if the bear hasn't shown itself by morning, we can hike back up to where we left the packs. Who knows? Maybe they will be intact?" Clay laughed. "Yeah, I wouldn't hold out that much optimism. The bear looked like it was tearing into your pack before we jumped." John said, "Quiet, I think I heard something." He was right. There was something moving through the brush not terribly far from where they were located. Both men began putting their clothes back on. They had taken them off to dry. The clothes were not dried yet, but they were much further than if they had not spent time with the fire. Clay said, "I guess it's back in the water. I can't say about a Sass, but if it's the bear, he's got the advantage in the darkness while on land. Advantage goes back to us in the water. All that drying out just to get wet again. Give me another second to get everything back into my Ziploc and I'm right behind you. John fell in behind Clay, and they both slipped back into the water, allowing it and the darkness to envelop them. The two men used one of their belts to stay together as they allowed the current of the cold water to ferry them further downstream. They did not choose to put out their fire since it had been built right next to the water's edge, with rocks placed around it. There was little chance of the fire ever spreading. They decided to leave it lit to fool whatever was stalking them. Hopefully it would keep the animals' attention until the fire died out, which would buy them a really nice head start on completing the 3-day walk they would need to finish to get back to civilization. Going downstream meant they were being carried away from their backpacks. Originally, they had planned on backtracking and seeing what they could find. Now, they had to decide if they were going back for their packs. They needed to get out of the water sooner than later. The obvious problem with that idea was there was still a lot of darkness left in the night. They both had pencil flashlights which would easily last the night, as they both also had backup AAA batteries. Having light to see to backtrack did not take away the huge advantage their stalker would enjoy. The pen lights provided a lot of light in complete darkness, but they only lit up about the first 7 to 10 feet in front of a person. Even if you happened to have the light pointed in the direction of an attack, you would still have almost no time to react to something that came into your vision at a high rate of speed. Worse is the predator would likely attack them from either behind or aside, meaning they wouldn't likely see it coming at all. Both men carried an emergency kit which is carried on their person at all times. It is a waterproof kit that contains 10 feet of nylon thread, hooks, a lighter, needle and thread, a filter straw to drink water straight from any source, and a tiny spray bottle of bug repellent. They also had their bear repellent spray, still unused, with them. When they first were confronted by the bear, there was too much wind in the wrong direction to bother using it. Or that was their conclusion, and so they did not try it. It might have worked, and had that been successful, they wouldn't have had to endure everything mentioned so far. But when you have basically 2 chances, you don't want to squander one, or especially both, in a less than successful attempt. Thus, the reason they chose to jump instead of empty their bear sprays. They still had 3 days of hiking to get out of there. Both men felt they had made the correct decision because they still had good defense, the bear spray, and the knives they carried on their person would provide a good secondary weapon. Once they got out of the water again, they would seek out some wood to make spears. The 2 men said nothing as the water carried them downstream. They didn't want to give away their position in case the bear was still stalking them. Twice, they came to spots where they could have easily left the water, but instead of getting out, they simply walked past the shallow area where exiting the stream would have been easy. By the time the night was half over, the moon had decided to make an appearance, which allowed the men to start being able to make out shapes along the stream. More than once, they were frightened by a shape either next to the stream or jutting out over it. Every time it turned out to be nothing more than a bush or tree, but it made for a very stressful ride all the same. Most times, it would happen to just one of the 2 men, because of their position, to whatever shape was upcoming. Limbs hanging down over the water had the distinct, rough shape in the moonlight of a big hare or fur-covered creature reaching down for them. Oftentimes, they would literally have to be carried past the shape before knowing for certain that it wasn't a monster about to snatch them from the water. They came upon a bear, but it was either a juvenile male or a female because it was considerably smaller than the one which had been hunting them. The creature was completely unaware of their presence, most likely because the water masked their scent, or perhaps it did know they were swimming by, but it just didn't care. It was a concern to the 2 men when they heard the bear growl back behind them. It had obviously met with something that required a vocalization to either scare away or to announce it would defend its position. Things escalated, and then it sounded like the bear was in a full-on fight. Back behind them and getting further away all the time was the sound of that bear fighting something. Maybe it was bear on bear, but it could have also been fighting something else. For the first time in quite a while, they felt like it was safe to speak. "I'm guessing 3 hours until the first hint of sunup," Clay agreed. "I'm about waterlogged. What say another hour, assuming the current stays strong and we don't come to any falls and then we jump out?" John yawned as he started to speak, which made him sound a bit funny with his first words. "Yeah, I'm ready to get a fire started and dry ourselves and our clothes. I think we are far enough ahead of everything now that we could afford the time to dry out and get some rest. But I agree, if we can get another hour of good current, that we take advantage and then get out. Keep your eye out for a bank that is rock but that has some trees or bushes not too far away. They will provide some wood for our fire." Clay replied, "I don't know about you, but my body is pretty beat up from hitting random rocks while floating the current. Gonna be sore tomorrow." John allowed a brief laugh back, more as a confirmation than because he thought anything was funny. They located their waterproof Ziploc bags and produced their pen lights. Then they immediately went to searching the area for dry wood to get a fire going. It proved they had chose well for a place to get out of the water, because there was plentiful dead wood to be gathered to start their campfire. They got their campfire going and then stripped down completely so they could get their clothing dried out by the fire. During the process of finding more dry wood, the two men discovered they had exited the stream at a good time. Upon venturing further and further to find more dry wood, they eventually went far enough they could hear the sound of water falling. The landscape from where they turned around and went back to their campfire was very rocky and became steeper. Back at the campfire, their underwear had reached a point of dryness, which was acceptable to go back on their naked bodies. They accumulated an adequate amount of firewood while waiting for their other clothes to dry out, and then turned their attention to their stomachs. Both men were hungry. They had some hooks and line, so they turned over some rocks until they found a worm they could get on their hook. It took John about 10 minutes to catch 2 trout using a method that no fishing expert would suggest. They tossed the fish on the coals of their fire and a short time later had breakfast. Clay saw his second Sasquatch, or more likely saw the same Sass for a second time, while putting on the rest of his clothes. They had dried out and the two men were dressing so they could continue their trek out of the Canadian wilderness. He didn't say anything to John at that time, since he barely got a glimpse of the creature before it disappeared into the cover provided by the surrounding nature. Before leaving the campsite, John made sure the fire was out, and Clay set the heads and remains of the 2 fish they had caught, cooked, and ate on top of a flat rock next to the ashes of their fire. He did his best to arrange it so it looked appetizing. Then the 2 men started their hike to get back home. The day became warm and then hot, and the 2 men eventually found their way back into the water after getting past a particularly steeper section of the landscape that was very rocky, and therefore the stream was kept to a thinner but deeper version of itself. It might have went on for about a mile during its steeper decline towards sea level. Then it slowed to a rate more attractive to human beings, and likely other animals as well. That was where the 2 men went back into the water. Along about supper time, Mother Nature proved she not only provided, but this time around, in a timely fashion. The men came upon a pair of turtles warming themselves in the sunshine. They were able to catch them both, so they pulled themselves out of the water and started a fire. By the time the sun was setting, they had turtle meat and a turtle soup, which they used the shells to cook the soup in. Truth told, a little salt would have went a long ways in making it a better tasting meal. But since they were hungry, it went down without much complaint. The guys had time to find plenty of firewood, which was good because they had real concerns as to how much longer their penlights might hold out. They needed to get through this night and then one more, and the men would be able to reach their transportation on the 3rd day. The guys found a mini box canyon that dead-ended with a sharp, steep wall that was only about 20 feet to the top. They decided if they built a fire at the opening of the mini canyon, it would not only provide a little warmth, but also be a barrier from any predators from reaching them. It seemed like their best place to try and get some sleep. Both men were exhausted. Yes, they were at risk if attacked from above, but bears were not known for dropping rocks, or themselves, that distance. The men figured if the bear came after them, it would have to be from the opening of the little box canyon. A good fire, placed right at the opening, should be enough to keep them safe. The fire had dwindled down to mere ashes when the sun started to come up. Just then, they heard something grunting as it approached their box canyon. To both men's horror, they saw waiting on the other side of their quickly failing bonfire was the bear they had encountered when they had their packs. He had a torn ear and was of same size. It was almost certainly the same bear. The damn thing must have tracked them the entire time. Obviously, if that was true, then it was also true their efforts to conceal their scent by going into the water must not have been very effective. Or maybe the bear was super smart, and it had figured out they were being moved downstream, so all it had to do was get there first and wait for the two men. In any case, the beast had caught up with them. At a most inconvenient time, too. The two men were trapped. The only way out was past the bonfire and the big grizzly on the other side of the fire. Even now, the big bear could have charged through the hot coals and had its way with them, but it seemed content to wait. The big bear didn't go 2 steps in any direction while waiting for the fire to cool down. It just sat there and watched the two men who were frantically trying to climb out of the canyon up that steep wall. Yes, it was only about 20 feet to the top for escape, but that 20 feet was not going to be climbed by the two men. They tried everything, including standing on the other's shoulders. The walls of the mini canyon were too steep and too soft to allow them any chance of getting a foothold. The bottom line was, they were not getting out of the canyon by any other means than the one they had originally counted on. Their fortress had become a prison. Clay and John were in a fix of their own doing. That's the thing about when choosing a spot for the night. When you gain security by cutting down the directions from which you can be attacked, you lose escape routes. A fair trade, mind you, but as the men were finding out, not always a happy conclusion. So there they sat, waiting for the fire to break down to the point that it was no longer a tool for keeping the bear at bay. The bear, on the other hand, seemed content to wait everything out. After another 30 of 40 minutes, the bear actually laid down and appeared to go to sleep. There was time to appreciate the beauty that nature had put into creating the grizzly bear. One look at that huge face and thick neck, and there was little doubt this was a creature to be respected. 6-inch long, razor-sharp black claws weaponized each of the creature's muscular front limbs. They were powered by hind legs capable of reaching speeds to match that of a deer, and that could climb a tree or wooden pole faster than nearly any other creature on the planet, and certainly of any that weighed anywhere near what a bear can weigh. They were a marvel of nature where there was very little room for improvement for the pinnacle their evolution had already achieved. These animals were designed to hunt and kill. They had a nose that was better than any other, including the hound dog. Imagine being able to track prey with the ability of a hound dog, and then to be able to unleash a fury upon that prey such as only a bear can do. What happened next was a complete surprise. The two men had rescued a few burning pieces of firewood and were trying to figure out the best way to use them as a defensive shield to get past the bear. It was a futile effort which they both seemed to realize at the same time. It also seemed to give new life to the bear. It had rose up and now was at the edge of the fire, sticking a paw in and then pulling it back quickly. While the bear did that, John decided to try the bear spray. He shot it across the fire at the grizzly, driving it back a few steps, but that was about it. They still had Clay's bear spray, but things were starting to look bleak. The bear was becoming more and more confident. It had returned to the edge of the fire and was back to sticking one paw on the coals and then quickly pulling it back. It would roar with an anger which would put fear into any human. John and Clay kept moving the firewood around in the fire, so to keep the heat up, and prevent the bear from jumping across. They maybe had an hour left before the fire simply had nothing left to burn. Then Clay got an idea. It came to him out of desperation. He had been grabbing literally anything to add to the fire, which at that point the only thing left were green bushes. Clay pulled one out of the ground and threw it, roots and all, into the fire. The bush didn't catch fire, but after a few minutes it did start to smoke. A lot. The guys got the idea that they would smoke everything up good and then try to make their escape with the smoke as a diversion. There were several of those bushes available. They began pulling them out of the ground and throwing them into the fire. The bear sensed something was up, and it began to pace back and forth in front of the fire. It obviously did not like the smoke, but at the same time, it was just staying back away from the worst of it. The bear showed no sign of giving up or going away. Then the bear got really brave, and it was clear to both men it was about to jump across the fire onto their side. Clay had no choice but to spend their last bear spray. It backed the bear up, but again did not completely discourage it. In fact, it seemed like the bear knew they were out of defenses because it got back up to the edge of the fire and was being even more aggressive. Suddenly, amongst the smoke, the heat from the dying fire, the grizzly dancing just on the other side of things, and the ever-growing panic between the two men, came their escape. The top part of a pine tree was set down into the canyon. Quickly, the two men began to climb out using the limbs which grew thicker and stronger the further up they climbed. As they climbed their way out, the bear became further impatient. It was trying to cross over the hot coals, but it would take a step and then back up quickly due to the heat. However, it became further and further frustrated, which then turned to obvious anger. And finally, the big beast roared as it crossed the hot coals and charged toward the pine tree that the men just climbed and were now kicking back over so it fell into the fire. The freshly plucked pine tree immediately began to smoke like a box of smoke bombs had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. As the pine was being kicked over into the fire, on the other end the bear had begun to try and climb it in pursuit. It roared in angry frustration, as it immediately became aware there was no chance it would be able to reach the two men who had climbed out of the canyon and were currently racing away from the location. The two men ran away in tunnel vision, with their absolute goal being to put as much distance between themselves and the bear as possible. As they continued to run away along the top of a short cliff, both men could not avoid wondering what it was that had saved them. It had to be the Sass. What else could have the strength to break that pine tree off and then to throw it down into the canyon? Unsure of how much time was bought before the bear caught up to them again, both men remained silent as they raced across the landscape. They knew they couldn't outrun the bear, but they thought that if they got lucky and the creature did give up pursuing them, then it didn't matter. If they got lucky and the creature couldn't pick up their scent, then it didn't matter. If they didn't get lucky and the beast tracked their scent, then they wanted time to find their spot for battle. They still had their knives, and they would cut spears when they reached an area with the resources. By lunchtime, the two men were feeling like they were being watched. Was it the bear? Possibly the Sass? They both felt it had to be the Sass that sent them down the pine tree. Do you suppose it stayed with them? Perhaps to provide further protection? Or did the pair of eyes watching them belong to a bear that had once again caught up with them? They continued to walk along the stream for the rest of the day. There was a constant feeling of being watched, but neither man ever saw anything, despite quick turnarounds. Both men had sunglasses that had some mirror-like qualities to them, so they tried looking into their glasses to see what was behind them, but they never saw anything. It didn't mean there wasn't something there, however. It was a very strong feeling which, because of their fear that it might be the bear again, was very tiring. Imagine as you make your way along the side of a stream that every time you near a bush or rock big enough to hide a bear, that you expect one to jump out at you. The toll it takes on a person's nerves is beyond exhausting. As their last night was starting to set in, both men felt more anxiety than any of the previous nights. For one thing, It sounded like there was something in the woods just outside of their visible sight. Second was the place they had to settle for a campsite did not have the wall they could use to ensure no surprise attack from behind. And last was the fact they knew this was their last night. The men serving in the Vietnam War had a name for guys who only had 1 or 2 nights left in battle before being sent home to safety. Short-timers. There was no secret about the anxiety experienced with the short-timers. Superstitions were rampant. Some guys wouldn't touch anything or be touched by anything their last couple of days. Apparently, there were too many sad stories about guys who became short-timers and never made it home. Clay and John were enduring such circumstance. Both were well aware they had survived 2 bear attacks. That spoke very well for their chances of making it back. They were close enough to be able to see the lights now when it became dark, the ones coming from the area they needed to reach for their vehicles. There was still a good part of a day's hike promised to both men as they gazed across the dark divide to where the lights could be seen. The night was starting out a loud one. Besides the crackle of the wood burning in their campfire, there was also an almost consistent foreign-sounding chatter that was not a conversation meant to be carried out across a valley or meadow. It sounded more like a couple of friends or maybe partners who had been assigned to either do them harm or perhaps be of help. There was another noise in the darkness beyond their campfire. This one sounded more like it was something less intelligent. Less or perhaps completely lacking in the capabilities of a higher-thinking creature. It was the bear. It had to be. What else would be making grunting noises as it bulldozed its way through the darkness, getting scratched by every thorn bush, bruised by every boulder taller than knee-high, and abused at every turn while it searched mostly with its nose for the 2 men. He was late to join the party, but had nevertheless arrived. Clay and John talked it over and concluded to go back into the stream. Yes, the water was becoming very tiresome, but it was the only way to ensure they wouldn't get a visit from their friend the bear. Neither man was fond of the idea of getting wet again because both had thought that part of their journey was over. They quietly went back into the stream. This time, they put out their fire before leaving because there was a slight chance it might get blown into something more. Since they were putting out the fire, they had to be quick about getting into the water before the bear decided to confront them. To their surprise, as they slipped into the water, the noise surrounding them seemed to escalate considerably. It might sound crazy, but both men thought they heard the sound of rocks being thrown at something, out there somewhere in the darkness. Then the whoops began. Next came knocks against a tree trunk, followed by the sound of more things being thrown at the same time. Then came a roar of pain. Something had injured, wounded, or at the very least, annoyed the bear that was stalking John and Clay. There was the sound of something big crashing through the brush, followed by more grunts and growls. If they had to guess from the sound of what was happening in the darkness, not too far from their location, the 2 men would have said the bear had met resistance and powered through. Then they both became more frightened than they had been the whole trip, which was saying a lot. They heard something splash into the water, not terribly far from where they continued to float down the stream, at as fast a rate as possible, without making any extra splashing noises. John risked giving away their exact location by speaking in a whisper. 2 yanks on the belt means we go under. 2 more and we surface. It was all that was said. Next, Clay felt the 2 yanks and the 2 men went underwater and swam with the current in hopes of putting some much-needed distance between them and the rogue bear. When they surfaced, they could hear something back behind them a ways. It was splashing the water over and over. Clay envisioned a big grizzly pouncing at the water, thinking they were there just under the surface. Then he felt another 2 yanks, and the 2 men once again ducked under the surface and swam with the current, allowing it to carry them even further away from what was splashing the water. They submerged and surfaced 3 more times in a row, doing the exact same thing. Finally, they had put about 2 football fields distance between themselves and whatever it was back behind, pouncing at the water. The 2 came up for air and continued to float down the stream, listening closely for any sign the bear had given up its search for them under the stream's surface. Another hour passed, which allowed the two weary survivors to lose some of the anxiety which had arrived with the noise. The bear was not far behind them. They kept listening, and there were plenty of hints that the bear had fell behind even further. The last few hours of that night were extremely stressful, despite feeling like they had put their troubles in the rearview mirror. When the sun came up, they had a much more secure feeling. This largely was due to knowing they would not have to spend another night out in the wild. The closer they got to civilization, the more they felt like there was nothing watching them any longer. When back at home and able to fully relax about what they had been through, the two men had some conclusions. The most profound thing they came away with was something they had always known, or at least suspected. The Sasquatch is a much less danger to human beings than are bears. First is you are much more likely to encounter a bear than to encounter a Sasquatch. Second is, as it turned out for these men, that the Sass may not always be against you. Who can guess for certain as to why? But the reason the Sasquatch helped these men might have been because they respected nature, and it might have been because they had chosen to enter the wild without any firearms. Or maybe these guys just happened upon a nice bunch of the big apes instead of a bunch that are not friendly